2 years ago, a mother and her young son set off for what should have been a peaceful weekend getaway in the Adirondack Mountains. It was the kind of trip many families dream of, just a few days away from the noise of everyday life, surrounded by nature's beauty. They had planned to go on a hiking trip, explore some trails, and maybe do a little camping. It seemed like the perfect escape. Little did they know that weekend would turn into a nightmare. The mother, Sarah, was in her late 30s, an adventurous spirit who had always loved the outdoors. Her son, Noah, was only 8 years old but already showed a keen interest in nature. They had gone on small hikes before, and Noah was always curious about the world around him. They had packed their gear and set out early on a Saturday morning, excited about the adventures awaiting them. Their plan was simple. They would hike along a well-known trail that looped around a beautiful lake, spending the night in a small cabin along the way. They had done their research, checked the weather, and were prepared for a relaxing trip away from the distractions of modern life. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and Sarah had made sure to let her friends know where they were going. The trail was popular but not too crowded, offering the perfect balance of solitude and safety. By late afternoon, they reached the cabin. It was a small wooden structure with a fireplace, a few basic amenities, and a clear view of the lake. It was just what they needed to rest after a day of hiking. Sarah set up their sleeping bags, and Noah explored the surrounding woods, collecting sticks and rocks. They were both in high spirits. They had dinner, told stories, and enjoyed the peaceful sounds of the wilderness around them. It felt like the perfect way to escape the daily grind, but by morning something had gone wrong. Sarah had planned to take Noah back to the trailhead, where they would finish their loop and return to their car. But when she woke up that morning, Noah was nowhere to be found. She checked every corner of the cabin, called out his name, and searched the area around the cabin, thinking he might have gone for a quick walk or gotten curious about the surroundings. But there was no sign of him. Panic began to set in. She knew this area well enough to understand that losing track of time in the wilderness could be dangerous. The weather was turning, and the sun was hiding behind a thick blanket of clouds. Sarah's heart raced. She started calling for Noah louder, hoping he would answer, but the silence around her only deepened the dread in her chest. It wasn't like Noah to wander off without telling her, especially after they had discussed staying close to the cabin. She tried to stay calm, rationalizing that he might have gone further along the trail. Maybe he had seen something interesting and decided to follow it. Without wasting any more time, Sarah grabbed a whistle from her pack and blew it repeatedly, hoping that Noah would hear it. She waited for what felt like an eternity but heard nothing in response. At that point, she knew she had to take action. She gathered her things, but the unease in her chest grew stronger with every passing second. She began walking along the trail they had come from the day before, calling Noah's name and hoping she would see him coming around the bend. Hours passed with no sign of her son. The trail that had once seemed so familiar and safe now felt like a maze, each twist and turn only adding to her frustration and fear. She checked her watch. Time was slipping away faster than she realized. The wilderness, which had once been her retreat, was now a vast, unfamiliar place. The wind picked up, the trees whispered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. By late afternoon, Sarah reached the point where the trail split into several directions. She stood there for a moment, trying to decide which way Noah might have gone. She was no longer thinking clearly. She couldn't tell if the uncertainty was from exhaustion, fear, or a mix of both. The sky grew darker, and the temperature dropped. She had to make a decision. Was Noah ahead of her or behind? The thought of retracing her steps to the cabin seemed impossible, but the longer she stood still, the more lost she felt. The next few hours were a blur of confusion and frantic searching. Sarah had no choice but to make her way back to the cabin. She couldn't think straight anymore. She had to find help. But when she arrived, there was still no sign of Noah. The hours stretched into a night of terror. She gathered her gear and trekked out to the nearest ranger station, hoping someone could help her find her son. By the time she arrived, it was nearly dark. She was exhausted, desperate, and on the verge of breaking down. The rangers immediately started organizing a search. calling in local volunteers and using all the resources they had. Helicopters were dispatched and teams of trained search dogs were brought in to help. The operation grew larger as the news spread. As the night wore on, Sarah's thoughts were clouded with dread. The thought that something might have happened to Noah was too much for her to bear. What if he was out there alone, lost and cold? Her heart broke at the thought. The search was grueling. Day after day, volunteers combed through the dense forest, retracing Sarah's steps, scanning every inch of the area for any clue. But no trace of Noah was found. The search continued, but it was clear the chances of finding him alive were growing slimmer with each passing hour. The weather turned colder, and the days turned into weeks. No new leads appeared. Even the best trackers and search dogs failed to uncover anything that could explain what had happened to the young boy. The community rallied behind Sarah, hoping, against hope, that the search would end in a miracle. But deep down, they all knew that the wilderness could be unforgiving, and the chances of finding him alive were slipping away. Weeks turned into months, and the search was called off. Authorities, having exhausted all possibilities, declared the case a missing persons incident and eventually a cold case. Sarah was left in shock, unable to comprehend how her son could simply vanish into the wilderness. She couldn't understand how he could be gone with no trace, no clue, and no reason. She still held on to hope, but with each passing day, the pain of losing him never lessened. She had to live with the uncertainty of not knowing what happened to her son, a mystery that would haunt her forever. The whole community was shaken by the disappearance. Everyone who had known Sarah and Noah wondered what went wrong, how the boy could have disappeared so completely from the face of the earth. Some still whispered about the wilderness, its dangers and its mysteries, but no answers came. As Sarah sat in silence looking out over the Adirondack wilderness, she couldn't help but wonder if Noah was out there, waiting to be found. As weeks passed, the shock of the disappearance began to settle into the community like a heavy fog. Sarah, devastated by the loss of her son, was left in a state of numb disbelief. No one could understand how this had happened. The Adirondack mountains, once a place of peace and adventure, had turned into a nightmarish maze for her. Despite the best efforts of the search teams, Noah was still missing. It was as though the wilderness had swallowed him whole. Each day without answers only made the pain sharper, and the more Sarah thought about it, the more questions filled her mind. Was Noah lost somewhere out there? Was he still alive? Or had something far worse happened that she couldn't bear to think about? The not knowing was the hardest part. Sarah couldn't understand how she could have let this happen. Hadn't she taught him to be careful? Hadn't she made sure he knew the importance of staying close? It didn't make sense. Noah had always been so good about listening. He would never have wandered off alone, not without telling her. Yet, the evidence, or lack of it, suggested otherwise. The search had started with such hope. Friends, family, and strangers alike had joined the search, rallying together to bring Noah home. The news of his disappearance had spread far beyond the local town, and soon volunteers from all over the state arrived, eager to help. The rangers organized teams, setting up a plan to comb through the thick forest and surrounding terrain. But even with all the help, there was no trace, no footprints, no sign of a struggle, no clue as to where he could have gone. The search, at first full of energy and determination, started to feel like a futile exercise in waiting. Each new day brought no answers. Sarah spent hours, days, wandering the trails herself. She couldn't stop looking, couldn't bring herself to sit still. How could she? As a mother, she felt it was her duty to keep searching, to keep hoping. But each time she ventured deeper into the forest, it only seemed to get harder. The wilderness was vast, and every direction seemed the same. The trees were endless, the undergrowth thick, and the silence of the forest was eerie. At times, she would call out Noah's name, but her voice would echo back at her like a cruel reminder of her loneliness. The long hours turned into days, then weeks, and with every passing day, Sarah began to realize something that tore at her heart. The chances of finding Noah were growing smaller. She knew the wilderness could be merciless. If he had gotten lost, if he had wandered too far, it could be impossible to find him. The search teams worked tirelessly, but as the days turned into weeks, it became increasingly clear that this was not a simple case of a lost child. Something was wrong, something deeper than anyone could understand. Sarah couldn't even begin to imagine what her son had gone through in those days after he had disappeared. Had he been scared? Had he cried for her just like she had been crying for him? The thought of him alone in the woods, cold and hungry, kept Sarah awake at night. The gnawing worry that he might be hurt or worse was a constant presence in her mind. She had to believe, though. She had to believe that he was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. But the community, too, was feeling the weight of the situation. The search parties, once full of hope, were now becoming exhausted. Local police were still involved, but their resources were limited. As time went on, the case began to lose its urgency, and other, more recent cases began to take precedence. The news coverage slowed down, and with it the community's sense of hope. The missing child had become just another story, fading from the public eye. But for Sarah, it was far from over. She couldn't accept that Noah was gone. She couldn't believe that her son was simply lost to her forever. She spent her days trying to hold it together, but at night, when the world was quiet, the tears would come again. Sarah would sit by the window, staring out into the dark forest, her mind racing with memories of Noah. She could still hear his voice in her head, still picture the way he smiled, the way he would always ask so many questions. "Why is the sky blue, Mom? Do animals talk to each other?" His curiosity had always been his greatest gift, and now it was gone. The silence in their home was deafening, days blended into weeks. And then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, the search was called off. The authorities had done all they could, they said. The dogs had searched. The helicopter had scoured the skies. It was time to move on. No one knew what had happened to Noah, and there was no longer any indication that he was alive. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, the finality of it. The fact that no one would search for him anymore felt like the last thread of hope slipping away. It wasn't long before the phone calls stopped. Friends who had been so eager to help began to pull away, unable to bear the weight of Sarah's grief. Even the most well-meaning gestures, the offers of food, the words of comfort, started to feel hollow. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone was waiting for some kind of miracle that would never come. But Sarah could never stop believing. She refused to give up. Every night, she would close her eyes and picture Noah, still out there, waiting for her to find him. In her heart, she believed he was still alive. She had to. It was the only thing keeping her going. Meanwhile, the rest of the world moved on. The disappearance became a cold case, a mystery that would likely never be solved. The Adirondack Mountains, which had once seemed so beautiful and peaceful, were now a haunting reminder of a lost child. The world continued, oblivious to the pain Sarah carried with her every day. Her life, once full of hope and joy, was now filled with emptiness. Noah's bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to what once was. His toys, his books, his clothes, all perfectly arranged, just as he had left them. Sarah couldn't bring herself to touch anything. It was the last piece of him she had left. Time continued to pass and the world moved on without Sarah. But inside her heart, nothing would ever change. She would never stop searching for Noah, never stop hoping. And though it seemed as if she was slowly losing herself deep down, she knew that she couldn't give up. Not on him. Not on the love between a mother and her son. 2 years had passed since Noah and his mother Sarah had vanished without a trace in the Adirondack Mountains. The memory of their disappearance weighed heavily on the community, but with time, the world had moved on. People had stopped asking questions, and the case of the missing mother and son had become just another unsolved mystery. The authorities had done their best, but there were no new leads. It seemed as if Sarah's worst fear had come true. Her son was lost forever, and the answers she so desperately needed were out of reach. But then, something unexpected happened that no one could have predicted. It came on an ordinary morning when a hunter named Tom set out into the wilderness with his dog. Tom had been in the Adirondacks countless times before. He knew the trails, the woods, and the wildlife as well as anyone. That day, like many others, he was hoping to bag a deer. He was alone, just him and his dog, a German shepherd named Max. The dog was well-trained, loyal, and had been Tom's companion for years. They wandered through the woods, enjoying the crisp air and the peaceful silence of the forest. Max was moving ahead of Tom as he often did, following a trail or scent that only he could detect. Tom wasn't worried. He knew the area well, and he trusted his dog's instincts. But then, Max suddenly stopped. Tom's first thought was that the dog had caught a scent of a deer, but when Max didn't move, Tom knew something was off. The dog was staring intently at something buried beneath a pile of leaves. It was odd, but Tom thought little of it at first. Maybe it was just another animal's den or some other hidden creature's home. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. Tom approached the dog and nudged him aside, kneeling down to see what had caught Max's attention. When he moved the leaves, he saw something that made his heart race. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small faded backpack. It was a backpack that, to Tom's surprise, looked oddly familiar. He didn't know where he had seen it before, but something about it struck a chord. Tom had been hunting these woods for years, and the idea that a backpack had been buried here, untouched for so long, seemed strange. As he carefully pulled the backpack out from the leaves, memories came flooding back. The local news stories about the missing mother and son, Sarah and Noah, came to mind. He hadn't thought about the case in months, but suddenly, everything clicked. The backpack looked exactly like the one that had been pictured in the news reports, the one that belonged to Sarah and her son. Tom's pulse quickened. Was it possible? Could this be the breakthrough the authorities had been waiting for? He didn't hesitate for a moment. Without wasting time, Tom immediately called the police. They instructed him to leave the backpack, where it was until they could get there, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something else might be buried nearby. He couldn't explain it, but the discovery felt significant, like it was part of something bigger. Tom stayed put, keeping a watchful eye on the spot where Max had found the backpack. Within an hour, law enforcement arrived at the scene. They quickly took control of the situation, ensuring that the area was secured and that the backpack was properly examined. News of the discovery spread quickly, and soon, investigators from various departments arrived, including a team of forensic experts. It was clear that the backpack was not just any lost item. This was linked to the case of Sarah and Noah, and the discovery might finally lead to answers. The authorities began to investigate the area surrounding the backpack, carefully digging through the earth to see if they could find anything else. They combed the area with search dogs, using all the tools at their disposal to find additional evidence. Time was of the essence, and everyone involved knew that the longer they waited, the harder it would be to find more clues. But just as hope began to rise, an unsettling silence hung in the air. There was no sign of any other belongings, no traces of footprints or signs that someone had recently been in the area. It was as though the wilderness had swallowed everything up, leaving behind only the backpack as the sole clue to what had happened. As the search continued, investigators began to piece together a theory. The backpack was a significant find, but it raised even more questions. How had it ended up so deep in the forest, far away from where Sarah and Noah had been last seen? Had they wandered off the trail, or had something else happened that caused them to become lost? Had they encountered danger, or had they simply gotten disoriented in the vast, uncharted woods? Sarah's family was immediately notified about the discovery. Her father, devastated by the news, made his way to the site. He was filled with a mix of emotions: fear, hope, confusion. After 2 years of wondering and waiting, he was now facing the possibility that he might finally find out what had happened to his daughter and grandson. But at the same time, he feared the worst. What if they had been out there all along, unable to find their way back? What if they had suffered alone and this was all that remained of their journey? The investigators continued their work, though there was a heavy sense of uncertainty in the air. Despite the discovery, they still had very little information. The surrounding area had to be examined thoroughly, but it was a long and difficult process. The forest was vast, and finding any concrete evidence that could shed light on the fate of Sarah and Noah was proving to be a challenge. As the search persisted, news of the discovery spread throughout the town. It reignited the long-dormant hope in the hearts of many. People who had once abandoned the search for Noah now found themselves wondering if the truth was finally within reach. Sarah's case, which had seemed to slip away from the public eye, was once again in the spotlight. But this time it was different. The discovery of the backpack wasn't just a symbol of loss, it was a symbol of hope. Could this be the break that would finally solve the mystery? As the days passed, the investigators worked tirelessly, digging deeper into the woods and searching for more clues. But even with the new lead, there were still no answers to the bigger questions. What had happened to Sarah and Noah? Where had they gone? And most importantly, had they made it out of the wilderness alive? The unanswered questions continued to haunt everyone involved, but at least now they had something to hold on to. The discovery of the backpack, a piece of the puzzle that hopefully would lead to the truth. The days after the discovery of the backpack were filled with a sense of urgency and hope that Sarah and Noah's family hadn't felt in years. The search for the missing mother and son had started up again, this time with renewed vigor. The blow. Authorities, determined to uncover more, worked around the clock. The news of the discovery spread quickly, and the entire community held its breath, hoping that this new lead might finally bring the answers they had all been waiting for. The investigation teams moved deeper into the wilderness, surrounding the area where the backpack had been found with caution. It was a vast stretch of forest, and no one knew exactly where it might lead, but they were determined to search every inch. Their main goal was clear. They had to find more evidence that would explain how the backpack had ended up there and whether Sarah and Noah had been close by. Forensic experts carefully examined the backpack. They found some items inside that might provide vital clues. Sarah's belongings, a pair of hiking boots, a water bottle, and a few other personal items, were there. But no signs of Noah. No trace of him at all. The absence of his items left everyone puzzled. Had he been carrying something of his own when he disappeared? If so, where was it? It didn't make sense. It seemed as if Sarah had been the only one to leave behind anything. The more they examined the backpack, the more questions arose. There were no signs of any struggle or damage, nothing that could point to an immediate danger or cause of death. Everything was intact. But the absence of Noah's personal items, his favorite jacket, his small backpack, anything that might have belonged to him, made the situation even more mysterious. Had he wandered off, or was he taken somewhere else? No one could say for sure. As the days passed, the investigators discovered more details. They began to trace Sarah's footsteps, following the route she might have taken when she first went into the woods. They looked at the map of the area, studying the terrain and evaluating how far they had traveled before things had gone wrong. But the wilderness was an unpredictable place, and there were still no clear answers. Local volunteers, who had originally helped with the search 2 years earlier, were back on the ground once again. It was incredible to see how much the community had rallied around Sarah and her family. People from all walks of life, hikers, residents, and even people who didn't know Sarah personally, all worked together with a shared goal: to find out what happened to the missing mother and son. With each passing day, the search expanded. The teams worked in teams of 2 or 3, methodically covering the land, searching for any clues that might have been missed during the initial search. It wasn't just about finding remains or belongings. They were looking for something, anything that might explain what happened. They checked under trees, behind large rocks, and in caves. They even looked for signs of wildlife disturbances, signs that could indicate something had happened out of the ordinary. Tom, the hunter who had discovered the backpack, returned to the area where he had found it, hoping to find more evidence. His dog, Max, had once again led the way, sniffing around the ground and occasionally stopping at certain spots as if he remembered the scent. Tom felt a deep sense of responsibility now. He had found the first clue that had sparked this renewed effort, and he couldn't help but wonder if he could uncover more. The team set up a small camp nearby, working in shifts, examining every inch of the land. It was exhausting work, and the days were long. Yet they remained hopeful, knowing that they had already come so far. As the investigation continued, new insights came to light. Sarah's family, despite the pain of the past 2 years, remained involved in the search. Her father, a man who had always been strong and steady, was now beside himself with grief. He still couldn't fathom how his daughter and grandson could simply vanish. He had spent every waking moment wondering if they were still out there. Had they been cold? Were they hungry? What had happened to them? His heart ached with every passing moment. It was as if time had stopped for him the day they disappeared. Despite the community's efforts, the trail still seemed cold. There was no sign of Sarah or Noah, and no further evidence to guide them. The authorities couldn't determine where the backpack had come from, or why it had been buried so deep in the forest. The forest itself, in its vastness, seemed to hide more secrets than they could uncover. The authorities decided to expand their search, bringing in more technology. Drones were sent out to fly over parts of the wilderness they hadn't been able to reach. Thermal imaging equipment was used to search for heat signatures, hoping to spot anything out of the ordinary. They even used sonar equipment to look for anything beneath the surface of the lakes in the area. But still, there were no new discoveries. Tom, the hunter, continued his search, knowing that the breakthrough they all hoped for might still be just a step away. He spent his days walking through the woods, carefully inspecting every area that seemed even the slightest bit unusual. He took Max with him, relying on the dog's trained nose to help guide him. But each new day brought nothing but silence. The woods were quiet, and the mystery deepened. Weeks passed, and the authorities were beginning to feel the weight of their limitations. No new evidence had come to light. The backpack was still the only clue they had, and no one knew where to go next. The sense of frustration began to set in. How could they have searched so thoroughly and still found nothing? The feeling of being lost in the wilderness, both literally and figuratively, grew stronger each day. But amidst the frustration, there was still a glimmer of hope. Sarah's family refused to give up. They remained hopeful that someday they would finally find the answers. Every new piece of evidence, no matter how small, was a step closer to the truth. In the meantime, Sarah's father, though devastated, was determined to keep going. He wouldn't stop searching. It was the only thing he could do for his daughter and grandson now. And as difficult as it was, he knew that even in the face of so many unanswered questions, the search had to continue. As the investigation moved forward, the town itself held its breath. Each person, in their own way, had become part of the search, even if they were not physically out in the woods. The community had invested so much in finding Sarah and Noah, and now they too felt the weight of the mystery. They needed answers, just as much as Sarah's family did. It wasn't just about finding the missing mother and son. It was about finding closure, about uncovering the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. But for now, the mystery remained unsolved. The woods, still filled with secrets, were waiting to give up the answers. And the search would continue, with the hope that one day, the truth would finally be revealed. This expanded version of Part 4 focuses on the continuing search for Sarah and Noah, the emotions of their family and the determination of the community. It adds tension while maintaining hope, keeping the story engaging for the audience. Let me know if you'd like to make any further changes. Months passed, and though the investigation into Sarah and Noah's disappearance continued, no new breakthroughs came. The search had expanded in every direction possible, but still, the mystery remained unsolved. The small Adirondack town, once bustling with news reports and community involvement, had started to settle into a strange quietness. For Sarah's family, the void left by the disappearance seemed endless. Each new day felt heavier than the last, with no answers to the questions that haunted them. Sarah's father, ever the hopeful man, still could not accept that his daughter and grandson were gone. He refused to give up. Every time the search seemed to stall, he would remind the investigators to keep looking, to keep searching for any small sign. He knew that there had to be something out there, a clue that would help them understand what had happened. But as the months wore on, even he had to face the painful reality that the search might not end the way they had all hoped. The search teams, too, had become exhausted. Their determination never faltered, but the wilderness was vast, and the more they searched, the more they realized how little they truly knew about the land. Even with advanced technology and resources, they had not been able to uncover anything new. It was as if Sarah and Noah had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the memory of their presence. The backpack that had been found, still the only clue, had raised more questions than answers. Was it simply abandoned, or had they placed it there, hoping someone would find it? The authorities couldn't say for sure, but each theory seemed less likely than the next. As the weather grew colder and the fall turned into winter, the community began to pull back. Life, as it often does, moved forward, even in the face of great uncertainty. But for those who had been closest to Sarah and Noah, it was impossible to move on. They clung to the idea that there were still answers to be found, that one day, the pieces of the puzzle would finally come together. But deep down, many had begun to wonder if they would ever find out what happened. One chilly afternoon, more than 2 years after Sarah and Noah had vanished, a phone call came. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. An anonymous tip had led the authorities to a secluded area near the cabin where Sarah and Noah had been staying. The tip came from a hiker who had recently passed through the area. They had noticed something unusual, a small clearing that seemed out of place among the dense forest. It wasn't far from where the backpack had been found. The authorities, still hopeful but cautious, immediately set out to investigate. When they arrived at the location, they were greeted with a sight that would change everything. In the clearing, just as the tip had suggested, they found more remains. This time a few personal items, pieces of clothing, and signs of what had been a camp. The items were old, weathered by time, but they were unmistakably Sarah's. They found a small sweater, a pair of shoes, and Noah's favorite baseball cap. There was a clear sign that someone had spent time here, but the remains were not human. It seemed as though the campsite had been abandoned long ago. What was most shocking was the discovery of a journal. The journal, though damaged by the weather, contained entries written by Sarah. Her handwriting was still legible, and as the investigators carefully flipped through the pages, they uncovered something that no one had expected. The journal was filled with notes about their journey, thoughts on the wilderness, and small details of their day-to-day life during the trip. It seemed as though Sarah had been documenting their time in the forest, perhaps as a way to remember the beauty of the place. But towards the end of the journal, the tone shifted. The last few pages were filled with worry. Sarah had written about feeling lost and disoriented. She had expressed concern about not being able to find her way back to the cabin. There were even mentions of strange noises in the night. The entries ended abruptly, and there was no more mention of Noah. The discovery of the journal sent a wave of shock and confusion through the investigators. Had Sarah been trying to leave clues for anyone who might come looking for them? Was she aware that something was wrong? And if so, why hadn't she reached out for help? The journal, though deeply emotional, didn't provide all the answers. But it was clear that Sarah and Noah had been in a desperate situation, and their time in the wilderness had been far more difficult than anyone had realized. The authorities quickly expanded their search in the area around the clearing. They combed through the underbrush looking for any other clues that might help them piece together what had happened. But despite their best efforts, they found nothing else. The forest seemed to hold its secrets tightly, refusing to give up more of the story. The journal had been an incredible find, but it still didn't explain what had ultimately happened to Sarah and Noah. Sarah's father, once again filled with a mixture of hope and grief, was called to the site to identify the personal items. He stood there for hours, overwhelmed by the sight of his daughter's things. The pain of the past 2 years came rushing back, and yet there was also a sense of relief. At least they had found something. At least now they knew that Sarah and Noah hadn't simply disappeared without a trace. But the answers he so desperately needed still eluded him. For Sarah's family, the discovery brought some closure, but it was bittersweet. The journal, the items, and the small campsite were pieces of a larger puzzle, but they didn't provide the complete picture. Sarah had clearly tried to survive, to make it out of the forest. But what had happened in the end? How had they ended up in such a remote part of the woods? Had they been lost? Or was there something more to the story that no one could understand? As the investigation into the disappearance continued, the town, too, began to reflect on what had happened. The memory of Sarah and Noah, though painful, would remain with them forever. It wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about remembering the mother and son who had gone missing and the incredible courage they had shown in their struggle to survive. They had fought against the wilderness, just as everyone had hoped they would. And though their journey had ended in tragedy, their story would live on. The search for answers never truly ended. There were still questions, still gaps in the story that no one could fill. But the discovery of the journal, the backpack, and the items scattered in the woods offered a sense of closure to Sarah's family and the community. It wasn't the ending they had hoped for, but it was the one they had. In the end, they could only hold on to the memories of Sarah and Noah, their love for each other, and the wilderness that had both brought them peace and taken them away. This final part of the story focuses on the breakthrough in the search, the emotional toll on the family, and the bittersweet closure they find in discovering more about Sarah and Noah's final days. It concludes the mystery while leaving some unanswered questions, which keeps the story engaging. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or further